Aloha, my name is Lauren Cruz, and I'm an environmental health specialist with the Hawaii Department of Health. Thank you for joining us for part 3 of our 4-part webinar series on groundwater basics. Today, we will be taking some of the concepts we learned in webinars 1 and 2 and applying them as we talk about what happens to contaminants as they potentially make it into groundwater. This webinar will consist of a 20-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. Should you have any questions on any of the material that's being presented in this webinar, please feel free to click on the little Q&A button at the top of the screen and type in your question. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but if we are unable to get to your question, please feel free to send us an email and we'll make sure that we get to you. In addition, if you click on the Q&A tab at the top, there is a link to a very short survey at the end, and we would really appreciate it if at the end of this webinar, you would be able to take a couple minutes and complete it. So today I'm joined by Dan Bernal, Bob Whittier, Wayla Lee, and John Jacob. So with that, Dan, can you please take it away?
Thank you, Lauren. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Aloha. Welcome to webinar number 3. We will talk about contaminant transport in groundwater. And so let's go ahead and review what we talked about briefly in webinars 1 and 2. We talked about our friend Pete the water drop, and Pete is composed of a very large number of H2O water molecules, and we talked about how peat may come down from rainfall. Peat may then go into the ground through cracks and crevices and migrate down to the water table. Remember, the water table is that zone where all the cracks and crevices are filled with water. And then peat may then move along through these different permeable zones in the subsurface and may eventually be taken out by drinking water pumping wells or water supply wells, or peat may continue migrating into streams or discharge back in the ocean. And we know that the ocean can evaporate and create water vapors, and peat can then return and condense in the clouds as part of that hydrologic cycle. We also mentioned that groundwater is a very important natural resource in Hawaii. 85% of the drinking water comes from our aquifers, which store the groundwater, as we talked about in our last webinar. So now, first of all, it's important to remember that our groundwater is safe. It's treated before it's sent to the homes. However, as part of planning, it's very important to look at the potential ways that groundwater contamination may occur. It, for example, may occur from, if we have improper disposal of livestock or human waste through, unlined collection pits or trenches or cesspools. It can occur from, pesticides and fertilizers that can be applied to the land surface. It can occur from even homes where, paint solvents or automotive fluids or other types of materials are dumped under the ground. It also can occur from leaking pipes that can carry the fuel. It can occur from underground storage tanks or releases at land surface. And also, it's important to remember that if we pump too hard from this important resource, we can also pull in seawater. So again, there are federal, state, and local resources and agencies that are available to protect groundwater and make sure that planning is occurring for this resource. And so at the state level, for example, there is monitoring that's performed of the groundwater quality. There's also corrective actions that may be performed. And also there's planning that is performed in terms of water quality plans, water resource protection plans, agricultural and water use development plans, and just state water project plans. And so all of this is part of the goal to make sure that this important resource is sustainable. Now let's talk more carefully about some of the ways that contaminants can reach groundwater in Hawaii. And so we'll give an overview here, and then we'll look at each of these a little more in detail later. And so one way that contaminants can reach groundwater, if the water table is deep, for example, contaminants can be released at land surface. They can migrate down, and like pesticides like to stick to the soils, and so they can, and other contaminants too, and can be trapped in the soils. And as additional rainfall occurs and more of the water goes down to recharge the water table, then some of these contaminants can be carried along in a dissolve phase where they're mixed with the water, and they can eventually reach the water table and form what are called these dissolved plumes. In addition, if we have, for example, a tank of diesel fuel or gasoline at land surface and it leaks, then again, these contaminants can migrate down and potentially float on top of the water table. Like when we have a cup of water and we put oil in the water, then the oil is less dense than the water, so it tends to float. And so we call, these types of, chemicals that float on top of the water table, we call them light non-aqueous phase liquids, or LNAPs. Okay. Another way that contaminants can reach the groundwater is through these denser materials. If we have salt, for example, dry cleaners use these chemical solvents, and these chemical solvents are denser than water, so they're going to migrate downward because of gravity too. And if you put them in a cup of water, they're going to be sink to the bottom because these solvents are denser than water. And we call these types of solvents dense non-aqueous phase liquids, or DNAPs. So let's look more carefully at the first case where we can form these dissolved plumes. And so again, if contaminants are released at land surface, they can migrate downward with infiltration from rainfall. They can sometimes be trapped into the soils, and as more recharge comes from rainfall and goes deeper into the earth, they can form what's called leachate, which is these chemicals can be dissolved in the recharging water that eventually may reach the water table. And if there's a sufficient amount of the contaminants, then as groundwater moves, it can then form a dissolved plume of these chemicals that are dissolved in the groundwater. The second way is these LNAPs, these light non-aqueous phase liquids. Again, we sometimes call them floaters because they float on top of the water, and they would require a spill in which the pure phase of the liquid would then go into the land surface through cracks and crevices. It may migrate downward, and it may be trapped on these different more dense rocks like the massive zones of basalt. And it may migrate laterally in these more permeable zones, which we call these clinker zones. And as these contaminants migrate, they may go deeper as a different phase. They can become trapped at different layers of these denser basalt materials. But if there's a sufficient size of a spill, it may eventually reach the water table at depth and float on top of the water. Now, when these chemicals float on top of the water, as groundwater moves through, it will dissolve some of these LNAPs and form a dissolved phase plume. And so these LNAPs can be a source for these dissolved phase plumes. Similarly, if we have a dense non-aqueous phase liquid, DNAP, remember, we call those sinkers. They tend to sink to the bottom because they're heavier than water. And so if a DNAP is spilled or released from at land surface, it can migrate through these cracks and crevices as a separate phase. It may be trapped on top of these lower permeability zones, but it may follow these preferential transport pathways that have higher permeability and become trapped at different levels and depths below land surface, and may then trap on top of these low permeability regions. If we zoom in, we can see that in some areas, we can see that these solvents as a separate phase can become attached to the mineral grains and the sediments. And so let's look next at some possible types of contaminants in groundwater, and there's many types. The first type that typically we've seen are organic contaminants. These can be those dry cleaning solvents like trichloroethene. They can be petroleum compounds like from gasoline, like benzene is a chemical, or they can be from pesticides or herbicides like atrazine. In addition, we can have inorganic type chemicals and contaminants like metals, like lead and arsenic and other types. There can also be, bacteria and viruses that can be in the water, and also radioactive chemicals, and some of the new types of contaminants that have been detected are the 1,4-dioxane and PFAS. And so, these chemicals are all different. And so they will occur in different locations depending on whether it's, for example, a commercial industry that released them, or maybe it's agricultural type settings, things like that. And so each one of these different types of chemicals does have a different mobility. And so some stick more than others to the sediments, and some will biodegrade more rapidly, while others can be more persistent in the groundwater. So let's look more carefully at the movement and fate of these contaminants in the subsurface. And so again, these spills can sometimes reach the water table, and then the groundwater can carry those chemicals along with it. And when the groundwater carries the chemicals along with it, we call that advection. Okay. But as the groundwater carries chemicals in the groundwater, they can also disperse and spread and mix with the groundwater. And we call that dispersion and also diffusion. And we'll look at those more carefully soon. But a very important mechanism that occurs for some chemicals in groundwater is biodegradation, and it can remove the chemicals from groundwater, but some chemicals may degrade more slowly than others. Let's look more carefully at the different mechanisms that contaminants will move in groundwater. And so the first one is, again, advection, where the chemicals are carried along with the groundwater as it moves along a groundwater flow pathway. Okay. Now, in reality, what goes on is, as the chemicals move along a groundwater flow line, in the subsurface, is they mix with the groundwater, and we call that dispersion. And so that forms a wider area of contaminants that occur in the groundwater, and we call that a contaminant plume. So let's look at how this spreading can occur, and one mechanism that we know about is called hydrodynamic dispersion. All that means is that these contaminants, when they move, they can cause it to spread out in the plume. And for example, one way that can happen is if you have contaminants moving in a fracture, in the middle of the fracture, the water is going to move more rapidly and carry the contaminants more rapidly along with it. Whereas along the edges of fractures or pore space, the chemicals will move more slowly. In addition, this pore space in between, for example, the different mineral grains and stuff is complicated. And so some chemicals will spread out and move out laterally, and that'll cause the contaminants to spread out, like we see here a little bit from a source area, and we'll get to that in a second. In addition, some can move more along more direct pathways and go a little bit further than the others. Now, if we look at a map where we're looking straight down on a map, and maybe this is an area where a spill occurred, as I mentioned, if the contaminants do reach the water table, then the groundwater, which may be moving this way, can carry those contaminants along as a plume. And so, if it's a very homogeneous type environment, remember we mentioned the beach sediments where the materials are relatively similar, then we might have a relatively symmetric plume. But in Hawaii, these plumes are very complex, and we'll look at that in the next slide. But what's going on is, we have these plumes as they move along. If the spreading that occurs in the direction of groundwater flow, we call that longitudinal dispersion. Okay, whereas the spreading that goes sideways, we call that transverse dispersion, and that can occur not only sideways, looking straight down at the earth, but also they can spread a little bit vertically too. So let's look more carefully at maybe a more realistic setting, like in Hawaii, where we have highly heterogeneous types of sediments of these different volcanic layers. And so let's see how these plumes can migrate and develop over time, and some other mechanisms like absorption and diffusion will also affect how they occur. And so, for example, if we have a spill, sometimes if it's a big enough spill, these contaminants can migrate down and reach the water table, and they're going to follow the connected permeable zones, and groundwater, as we mentioned, by advection will carry them along. And so after a longer period of time, this groundwater can carry these contaminants along, or they're going to move in a more irregular manner because of the heterogeneity, the differences in the permeabilities that occur in the subsurface. And over a long enough period of time, these chemicals can migrate through these connected permeable zones and occur at greater distances away from where the spill occurred. So advection just moves these chemicals along with the groundwater along the more permeable zones. But an important mechanism that can also occur in the subsurface is called sorption. And sorption is essentially that some of these chemicals like to stick to the rocks and sometimes organic carbon. And so we call that sticking adsorption. And so the chemicals, as groundwater moves, some of the chemicals can stick to the rocks and sediments. Pesticides can absorb a lot. And so later, they can then be released, and we call that a desorption. Okay, so sorption and desorption occur also. And sorption, what it tends to do is when these chemicals are stuck, then they're spending more time stuck than moving. And so the chemicals that tend to absorb more are not going to migrate as far away from the source zones. Now, another important mechanism is diffusion. And so we can think of diffusion as, if we had a cup of water and we put some dye in it, as you know, the chemicals, the water molecules are present, but the dye molecules will tend to spread out by just the fact that these molecules are thermally are heated and they can move around and they're agitated. And so they tend to spread over time, as we know, if you look in a cup of dye, and eventually these molecules will spread out and diffuse more evenly throughout the cup of water. And so we call that diffusion, the spread of particles from high concentration to low concentration. And diffusion occurs too as these chemicals move by advection through these connected permeable zones. They will also diffuse out into the less permeable zones. Another important mechanism is, as we mentioned, contaminant biodegradation. And so if we have chemicals that are applied to land surface or released, they can get into the soil. And there are natural occurring microorganisms that are safe for us, but they like these contaminants and can eat them or breed them and use them to grow. And so these natural microorganisms can sometimes remove the contaminants from the soil and the groundwater. And it's very complicated, the processes that occur. It depends on the water temperature, the pH, and other factors. So let's look at some of the potential impacts of contaminants in groundwater. And some of them are, for example, health risks. Exposure to different chemicals can lead to health issues. There's also environmental risks. Contaminated groundwater can potentially harm ecosystems, plants and fish and aquatic life and animals. And if we do have impacted, soil or groundwater, then there's an economic impact because there's a cost to clean up the groundwater and the soil. And there's also a community impact. Sometimes we may need to, have water conservation or use restrictions until the water is cleaned. Okay, again, let's look at some, hazards that are posed. And just remember, the water is safe. It's treated before use, but it's important for us to understand how these hazards can occur so we can prevent them. And so, for example, we know that if we have industry, the toxins can be released to the air. And so we want to be careful about the air, make sure it's safe and clean. We can also, have, crops that can be impacted by pesticides or just sprays that can affect, the plants and animals. And as we know, if we have tanks that can leak and release contaminants, it can sometimes migrate down as an L-NAPLS free product or maybe a D-NAPL, but they then can be, reach the water table and maybe float. And these floating ones, for example, can act as a source that can build out a dissolved plume. And sometimes these dissolved plumes, can discharge to surface water and potentially affect fish, or they can sometimes emit vapors. And again, the wells can be impacted, but when they're detected, then they're certainly going to be treated, and any water that reaches the public is treated before use. So again, when do contaminants require action? Well, we need to remember that the groundwater is shaped by the environment that it moves through, and no water is perfectly distilled. The groundwater we drink has minerals in it. And so we have to keep in mind that there are trace minerals in it. And so risk really depends on the concentration levels of any contaminants, not just their presence. And there are very strict standards that are set to protect human health and the environment. For example, the US EPA has maximum contaminant levels, and the Department of Health has environmental action levels. And so water is regularly tested and examined against these levels. And when there are exceedances, then investigations are performed and potentially cleanup of the groundwater resources. Now, to end this webinar, here's a nice resource that's available to the public. Here's the web link to it. And so what this resource does, it allows one to look at a particular year and look at different chemicals and see, what types of chemicals have been detected in the groundwater. And so this is a map of for example, the herbicide atrazine, and we can see historically it's been detected in different areas. Many of these problems are no longer there, but we have this record, and so it's useful to use this resource to examine the groundwater and also the safeness that it really is. So thank you for your time. Our next webinar will look at essentially contaminant plume and aquifer cleanup, and we look forward to webinar number 4. So see you next week, and thank you again.
Thanks, Dan. Let's go and move into some questions. If anyone had any questions on the material presented, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. We have one right now for Bob Whittier from the Safe Drinking Water branch. Hey, Bob, if something like fuel spills into the aquifer, where does it go?
Okay, well, that is a fairly complex question, but generally, first thing that's going to happen is it's going to move downward. It's going to move under the influence of gravity. It's going to continue downward until it hits a barrier, some hard rock or clay, and then it may spread laterally, but again, it'll find a pathway downward till it hits the water table. And as Dan pointed out, that fuel tends to float on the water table. So it will generally move in the direction of groundwater flow, although it can, if the spill is large enough, move under its own influence, at least for a limited distance. But generally, as with groundwater, the contamination is going to move from areas of higher elevation, particularly groundwater elevation, to areas of lower elevation. So, the term we used, Malcolm Mackay. There are loss pathways along that travel, and as Dan mentioned, biodegradation. It will remove fuel. It will tend to absorb to the soil. Some of it will evaporate. And so at some point it becomes what we call immobile and will no longer advance. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. The next question is for Wayla Lee from the Hazard Evaluation Emergency Response Office. Wayla, sorry, let me read this. So Wayla, can all contaminants be biodegraded, and how quickly do contaminants typically degrade?
Thanks, Lauren. That's a good question. So the short answer is not all contaminants could be biodegraded. So biodegradation really depends on the chemical type, the contamination type, the chemical structure, the specific suitable microbes to degrade it, and also the specific environmental conditions. So for example, like some contaminants like the petroleum hydrocarbons, there are specific microbes that are able to eat them or break them as carbon source or for the energy production. And there are also some chemicals which are very resistant and recalcitrant, like the trichloroethane. So they are requiring very specific microbial pathways to be degraded. And also there are some inorganic compound, also heavy metals like lead or mercury. They're not able to be broken down and degraded by the microbe, but they can undergo some transformation pathway, like the microbe can transform them from the most toxic forms into the less toxic forms. And the second question that is how quickly the contamination could be degraded. So that really depends. The time will be varied from over months to years. I would say depends on the bacteria type and also the environmental conditions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayla.
Mm.
I think the next one is for Dan. Dan, could you explain what are some of the factors that would cause a chemical such as pesticide to commence desorption?
Sure. I think these pesticides prefer to stick to the sediments and stuff, but sometimes they can because the groundwater is moving, and so the moving groundwater can cause them to sometimes become unattached, and we call that desorption. And so in cleanup too, as we'll talk about next webinar, that's an issue we have to keep in mind, is that sometimes this desorption will make the chemicals longer to be able to clean up.
Thanks, Dan. I think the next question is for Bob Whittier from the Safe Drinking Water branch. Bob, can you explain the function of a groundwater capture zone in relation to preventing contaminant plumes from spreading?
Okay, there's two uses for a capture zone. One would be and usually we use groundwater models to identify that zone that will contribute water to a well. So if we have a spill that is at area A, we will look and put a well down the gradient or down the groundwater gradient from that and point B and start pumping. Using a groundwater model, we will work to see if that zone of contamination, that point of contamination, is within the capture zone. Now, another use for a capture zone, though, is in our drinking water protection. And frequently, when somebody is looking to put in a drinking water well, they will have a groundwater model done to look at the zone of contribution or the capture zone to that well, and then place the well so that there is minimal contamination within that zone of contribution. But either way, they both work, one to prevent the spread of contamination and the other to prevent contamination from entering our drinking water sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. The next question we have is for John Jacob from the Hazard Evaluation and Emergency Response Office. John, can you explain why there are acceptable limits for levels for contaminants?
Sure. So that is, I'll try my best to explain it here. It's not a very easy answer. So ideally, you want no contaminants. In other terms, you want zero, but that is almost never possible. So the acceptable levels are kept, like Dan had mentioned, there are MCLs, EALs. What we do is we look at various factors, such as the toxicity factor of the specific contaminant of interest, and what is the lab detection level. So some instruments or some chemicals can only be detected above certain levels, below which the machines are not advanced enough to detect it. And also the cost required for remediation, because sometimes it's to achieve a very low level, it may cost millions and millions of dollars. So considering these three, there are other factors to be considered, but these are the three, that is toxicity factors, detection levels, and cost of remediation. We come up with a number in the middle where it satisfies everything. Now, I just want to remind you, just because there is a contaminant doesn't mean it is toxic. Again, it's the dose that makes any contaminant toxic. So as long as we keep it below that level, so what the EPA and even the HERE office, what we use as a standard is if a child, so that's a vulnerable population, get exposed to the specific contaminant, I'm just going to say XYZ, for 350 or 65 days, if there shouldn't be any adverse outcome associated with that specific contaminant. So considering a lot of algorithms and a lot of calculations, we come up with acceptable levels at which there shouldn't cause any health adverse effect or any environmental risk associated with it. I hope that helps.
Thanks, John. The next question's for Bob Whittier from the Safe Drinking Water branch. So Bob, what is the most used method technology for tracking contaminant movement through groundwater pathways?
Well, our most common method is put in monitoring wells, but they are expensive. And you have to have some knowledge of the groundwater flow in order to place them correctly. Other ways to track that would be, if the depth of groundwater is shallow enough, we can actually detect the vapors from the plume at the ground surface. And that is a much more economical method of tracking a plume. Another common method, indirect, would be groundwater and contaminant transport modeling. We'll develop a groundwater model. We will calibrate it so that the groundwater elevations that the model says agree with what we measure. Then we can do contaminant transport, where, of course, groundwater and contamination flows downhill, and we can use that model to predict where it would flow. But then we go back, of course, to our most standard method, and that is monitoring wells, to confirm that our model is in fact telling us the correct answer. And if not, then we have to go back and calibrate the model. So, thank you.
Hey, Bob, one more question. It's regarding the Safe Drinking Water, the drinking water test website, or the website with the drinking water test results on it. Does it only list positives, or does it list all data?
It only lists positives. I would have to check with Safe Drinking Water branch, but all data should be public domain, even the non-detects. But it is the, of course, detections that most people are interested in. Or I should not say public domain, but a public record.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. It looks like we're a little over 12 o'clock, so if we were unable to get to your question and you think of anything further that you'd like to ask, please feel free to email us at curtis.pruder@doh.hawaii.gov, and someone will get back to you on that. We look forward to seeing everyone next week at our webinar number 4, which we will talk about cleanup options and contaminant plumes. Thanks, everyone.